Well, there were a ton of viewer questions around the Kirk case and the autopsy. So I'm going to break all of that down for you. Hi, I'm Melba Pearson, also known as the Resident Legal Diva, and this is an episode of Ask the Diva, the Kirk Case Files. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to Legal AF for all things at the intersection of politics and law. So, I've been doing a series of videos explaining the legal procedures and what's happening in the case of Tyler Robinson, who is the person accused and charged with the killing of Charlie Kirk. So a lot of you were very curious about the autopsy process, and I'm going to name off a few questions, and this is certainly not the entire list, but it's a lot of them. So we have Barnes Multimedia asking if there will be an autopsy and toxicology report on Kirk because he's already been buried. At Beth M6441, how can you have a murder charge without an autopsy? Super Jananimo, if you were defense counsel for the defendant, would you have wanted to be present to observe the autopsy? Dr. Shoot, do you think that the absence of an autopsy will hamper the prosecution when where a qualified coroner has not established beyond doubt the cause of death and the likeliest event which caused the death? And of course, if there was no autopsy, is it hard to prove the murder? And what does the autopsy show? So let me start with who's even involved here. So most states have a county coroner. I mean, the term coroner, medical examiner is interchangeable, means the same thing. So most states have county coroners broken out that way. Utah is different. They have a statewide office called the Office of the Medical Examiner, and they're the ones who perform the required autopsies and issue the findings. But autopsies are not public documents under Utah state law, and that is not unusual. Most states, it's the same thing, like autopsies aren't made public for kind of obvious reasons, right? Because there's photos that come with it. It's very graphic, things like that. They usually don't come out as a public document, but we learn about the autopsy findings either in court when we hear the testimony, or we may hear bits and pieces from defense counsel or something along those lines. But the actual full report is never going to be available online unless it's a leak. It's not supposed to happen. And interestingly enough, too, the privacy around an autopsy is so intense that the Office of the ME can't, and when I say ME, medical examiner, that's the shorthand, they can't even confirm or deny whether or not an autopsy is done. Now, trust and believe, an autopsy is always done in a suspicious death. The Office of the Medical Examiner can't necessarily talk about it. So they're not going to be like, yeah, we did an autopsy on so-and-so, but we're not going to tell you the findings. They're literally going to be like, they're not telling you anything, right? So let's look at the importance of an autopsy and sort of how this all plays out. So the reality is when you've got a homicide case, the body is the silent witness and one of the most critical pieces of evidence in a homicide case. Now, the forensic pathologist, medical examiner, coroner, is the one who basically is speaking on behalf of the person that's been deceased to be like, this is what happened to them based on science. They can't speak to the facts. They can't speak on anything else, but they can say, based on looking at this body, this is what happened to them. This is how their life ended. And so these are key facts, obviously, that can make or break whether or not someone is going to go to prison for murder or not. So now turning back to Utah. Like I mentioned before, the Office of the Medical Examiner, OME, has jurisdiction over any death that is suspicious, unusual, or potentially non-natural. And so the law is very clear that the autopsy shall be performed when it's requested by the district attorney, county attorney having criminal jurisdiction, or the attorney general. In a known or suspected homicide, this request is made almost immediately, right? And so the medical examiner in the state of Utah has jurisdiction over deaths resulting from violence, gunshot, suicide, accident, or any death under suspicious or unusual circumstances. So obviously, homicide, squarely in the four corners of that. And so the autopsy is the procedure that we can find out two things. First off, cause of death. What was the specific injury or disease that caused the death? So was it the person expired due to a penetrating gunshot wound, right? And the trajectory of the bullet went from here to here, and at this angle, going through these organs, et cetera, et cetera. So he literally gives the pathway to which the person ended up leaving this life. It also, the second part of an autopsy is that it talks about what the manner of death is. And so the legal classification, is it a homicide? Is it an accident? Is it suicide? Or is it undetermined? Meaning that the pathologist, the medical examiner, coroner could not ascertain to a reasonable degree of medical certainty what it was that killed, like how the person died. Or they may know that, listen, the person died by hitting their head, but it's not very clear as to whether or not it was an accident or whether it was a homicide. So I'm going to leave it as undetermined. Not unusual, but it's definitely a better case scenario than, if you're in a situation where, as a former prosecutor, right, and you're trying to prove a case that you believe is a homicide. If it says undetermined, at least you can work with it. If it says that it's not a homicide altogether, or kind of like in those situations where initially the coroner says, oh, this looks like a suicide, but then later on you find out that the surviving spouse had a whole insurance policy and they were the sole beneficiary and all of that, and you're, wait a minute, we got to dig back and look. Well, the main hurdle in those types of cases is that the original coroner's report said suicide or whatever, that the matter was not homicide, and now you have to get them to correct it, and they may not, and now you've got to basically fight uphill. So that's why sometimes undetermined is the second best option to the main finding of homicide, right? So if they can't come back with homicide, come back with undetermined, please, right? So that's the story behind that. So when is an autopsy done? Listen, I'll tell you right now, time is of the essence, tick tock, because the goal in any homicide is to perform that autopsy ASAP, as soon as the body is discovered and recovered, and then taken to the medical examiner. And the reason why it's so important that it's done ASAP is, number one, you got to preserve the evidence. So as soon as someone passes away, decomposition kicks in. And so when you want to look for drugs or alcohol, you want to look for other internal injuries, you're trying to figure out the time of death, all of that becomes less reliable the further along the body is in the decomposition process. So that's an issue. And then secondly, this is important for law enforcement as well as prosecutors, because they need the initial findings to be able to confirm the manner of death, start to guide their investigation, and figure out what the appropriate charges are for this case. And so in Utah, as in most states, the Office of the Medical Examiner gets custody of the body immediately upon notification. And while that full autopsy report might be like 6 to 8 weeks out, they can pretty much give you, the main points that you need to know within 24 to 48 hours. So the actual postmortem exam, which is the physical and the internal exam, is done within 24 to 48 hours, and then that information can be given to law enforcement. The full toxicology, all the reports in terms of blood tests, this and that is going to take 6 to 8 weeks. So that is why prosecutors are able to file charges within a few days of a homicide, because they already know what the manner of death is. So that's why they're able to move forward. And so in the state of Utah, the OME, Office of the Medical Examiner, has to submit preliminary findings to the state for a death certificate within 5 days of death. And if the autopsy and tests aren't finalized, so for instance, they do the autopsy and they're like, really want to wait on the toxicology report because I've got some questions here. They file the cause and manner as pending, and then they update it later on down the line. So when you're actually doing an autopsy, who all gonna be there? All right, so first of all, the autopsy is in a room that's secure. It's a controlled environment because, again, that whole decomposition thing, you're gonna want the temperature to keep it cool. And then The only people that are present are the essential personnel. So the family's not there, defense attorney's not there. I know often, we see on TV and a lot of these shows a whole bunch of people up in the no. It's very streamlined. So you've got the actual person that's doing the autopsy or autopsy technician. So as well as the actual pathologist. So the pathologist, medical examiner, coroner, is the one that does the actual autopsy. They have a tech that's with them who helps them, passing the instruments, moving the body around, labeling things, all of that. You have a photographer that documents every single step of the autopsy. So autopsy photos are very critical pieces of evidence that are used at trial. You will often have the detective present because, again, whoever it is that has jurisdiction over the case needs to have a better understanding of how this person passed away. And they're going to want to know where the wounds are and compare that to any evidence that they end up recovering from the crime scene or wherever the case may be. And then additionally, from the law enforcement side, you also have an evidence tech who might be there in order to claim and basically make sure there's a proper chain of custody. So if, let's say, you cut the clothes off of the victim's body, well, the clothes you want to have that in evidence to be able to use at trial. Well, the evidence tech will then take it, impound it, label it, seal it, and then take it to the police department, make sure it's logged. And then that way, when it comes to trial, the prosecutor can say concretely, hey, it was taken directly from the autopsy. It was not tampered with in any way. Nobody messed with it. This was the date it was sealed, and this is when it's been opened, et cetera, et cetera. So again, the family, attorneys, general public, media, no one else is allowed to be present in an autopsy. And so that autopsy report becomes vital evidence as well for the actual trial, but that doesn't mean the report just comes in just like that. You need the pathologist to actually testify to the process, what they saw, what they did, and all of that. And of course, that means under the Sixth Amendment that the defense attorney has the opportunity to cross-examine the medical examiner to be like, well, did you, do everything according to protocols, or are there other alternative explanations for the injuries that were found in the autopsy? So in other words, maybe questioning the angle of which way the bullet went, let's say in a case like this, or, is it possible that it could have come from a different angle, or whatever the case may be. So that is a very important step for the defense to be able to question whether or not this is the person charged is actually the person that committed this crime. So, in conclusion, this is how an autopsy works. It is so critical in proving whether or not the person that's charged is actually the person that committed the crime. And it also gives the jury a better understanding of the reason why the victim is no longer with us. So to answer everyone's questions, the autopsy and toxicology has already been done. Question is whether or not the report is available to law enforcement. We will never see the report. So there's that. The murder charge came about because within 24 to 48 hours, the medical examiner was able to tell prosecutors as well as law enforcement that this was in fact a homicide, hence the reason why charges were filed within 10 days of Charlie Kirk being murdered. The defense counsel cannot be present, and basically you're not going to have a homicide case without an autopsy unless the body hasn't been found. And no body homicide cases, tough, doable, but tough. But that, of course, presents a whole other set of dramas. And so there you go. Now, I cannot comment on any of the trajectories or anything like that. I am going to wait until we get to trial. I want to hear what actually comes out in the courtroom, because that is what's going to matter at the end of the day. Because I know a lot of folks are like, what? Can you talk more about the ballistics, this and that? I saw a video over here that no. Somebody else's opinion is not what's coming in court. I want to hear what the ballistics people, what the medical examiner, everything. I want to hear what they found and what's presented in the prosecution's case. And once I hear it, then I can make a better determination, because it's like a lot of things are floating around out there and we're not exactly getting the full and complete picture of what's going to be presented at trial. So I'm not going to spin my wheels, and I'm not going to have y'all spinning your wheels for something that may not even be a reality. So I'm keeping eyes on what actually is going to matter in terms of what the jury is going to be able to consider in terms of deciding the guilt or the innocence of Tyler Robinson. So I hope that answered your question. Keep those questions coming. This is my jam. I love answering, your questions about the criminal justice process, because again, it's something I spent a great deal of my life doing. So keep them coming, keep them coming. All right. I'm Melba Pearson, also known as the Resident Legal Diva, and this was Ask the Diva. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to Legal AF for all things political and legal, and hit me up on socials. Stay safe, stay informed, and keep demanding justice. Take care.
In collaboration with the Midas Touch Network, we just launched the Legal AF YouTube channel. Help us build this pro-democracy channel where I'll be curating the top stories at the intersection of law and politics. Go to YouTube now and free subscribe at Legal AF MTN. That's at Legal AF MTN.